The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a living thing, and through that gray curtain emerged shapes that gradually resolved into human forms, dozens upon dozens of warriors standing motionless in a perfect circle that enclosed a small cabin completely. An old man stood in his doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame for support, his failing eyesight struggling to count the impossible number of armed men who had appeared as if materialized from the earth itself. Inside the cabin, a baby whimpered softly, the sound that had dominated his existence for the past 5 days, the tiny life he had saved without thought for consequences that now surrounded him with lethal intent. His mind, still sharp despite his 72 years, raced through possibilities and explanations, trying to understand what he had done to summon this army to his doorstep, trying to remember if there were protocols for situations like this that his fading memory had forgotten. He had lived alone in these mountains for more than 30 years, had been forgotten by the world, and had gladly forgotten in return. And now, in what should have been his final peaceful years, he faced a reckoning whose nature he could not begin to comprehend. If stories about unexpected consequences and the weight of choices made in isolation speak to you, consider subscribing to discover how one decision can shatter decades of solitude and transform the meaning of a life. The summer of 1729 brought oppressive heat to the Allegheny Mountain region, the kind of weather that made even the most resilient creatures seek shade and water, that turned forest trails into corridors of stifling air where breathing felt like drowning. The old hunter had retreated deeper into his cabin than usual, venturing out only in early morning and late evening to check his snares and gather water from the spring that provided his only reliable source in this remote location. His name was Silas Carpenter, though he had not heard anyone speak it aloud in perhaps a decade, had almost forgotten to sound his own identity pronounced by another human voice. Silas had come to these mountains as a young man of 40, fleeing a life that had collapsed around him in ways both tragic and shameful. His wife had died in childbirth along with a baby. His small farm had been seized for debts he could not pay, and his reputation in the settlement had been destroyed by accusations that were partly true and partly malicious invention. Rather than face continued humiliation or possible imprisonment, he had simply walked away from civilization, carrying only his rifle and basic supplies, and had kept walking until he found a place so remote that no one would ever think to look for him. 3 decades of solitude had transformed Silas from a broken farmer into something else entirely, a man who moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of the animals he hunted, who could read weather and behavior of birds and predict game movements through subtle signs invisible to ordinary observers. He had built his cabin with his own hands using only an axe and determination, had learned which plants were edible and which medicinal, had survived winters that would have killed most men and summers that tested endurance in different but equally challenging ways. He had become, in essence, more creature than man, his humanity preserved only in the memories he occasionally revisited and in the careful maintenance of skills like reading that served no practical purpose, but reminded him he had once been part of society. His isolation was nearly absolute. Perhaps once every few years, he would encounter another trapper or hunter working the territories, and these meetings were brief and uncomfortable, marked by mutual wariness and minimal conversation. Silas preferred it this way, had chosen this life specifically because it required nothing from him except survival, demanded no explanations or apologies, allowed him to exist without judgment or expectation. He had made peace with dying alone in this cabin, had accepted that his bones would be found eventually by some stranger if they were found at all, and this prospect did not trouble him because he had stopped believing his life held significance worth preserving in anyone's memory. 5 days ago, that carefully constructed solitude had been shattered by a sound he initially thought was an injured animal. Silas had been checking snares near a creek about 2 miles from his cabin when he heard crying, distinctly human and distinctly infant, coming from a small clearing he sometimes passed through on his rounds. His first instinct was to ignore it, to tell himself he was imagining things, or that whatever tragedy had produced that sound was not his responsibility. But the crying continued with a desperation that eventually overrode his reluctance, and he found himself approaching the source despite every instinct telling him to walk away. In the clearing, beside a dead fire in a makeshift shelter that had partially collapsed, lay a Mohican woman who had clearly been dead for at least a day, her body showing the ravages of severe fever. Beside her, wrapped in a deerskin that had come partially loose, was an infant perhaps 3 or 4 months old, crying with a thin wail of advanced hunger and dehydration. Silas stood frozen, staring at this impossible situation, his mind refusing to process the implications, while his heart responded to suffering in ways his intellect tried to suppress. He should have walked away. Every practical consideration argued for leaving the baby to whatever fate awaited it, for not involving himself in native affairs he did not understand, for maintaining the boundaries between his world and theirs that had allowed him to live unmolested in territories where tensions between settlers and indigenous peoples ran high. But Silas found he could not turn his back on a dying infant, could not let a helpless child perish when he possessed a means to potentially save it, regardless of what complications that choice might create. Silas picked up the baby with trembling hands, his movements awkward after decades without physical contact with another human being, let alone an infant. The child was alarmingly light, clearly malnourished, and its crying had weakened to barely audible whimpering that suggested the end was approaching if intervention did not come immediately. He examined the campsite quickly, finding evidence that the mother had been traveling alone or had been separated from companions, that she had been sick for several days before death claimed her, and that no one else appeared to be nearby or coming to help. The decision made itself without conscious deliberation. Silas wrapped the baby more securely in the deerskin, gathered what few supplies remained at the abandoned camp, and began the 2-mile trek back to his cabin. The journey took twice as long as usual because he moved carefully to avoid jostling the infant, and his 72-year-old body protested the unaccustomed burden and pace. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had set and the baby had stopped crying entirely, which Silas knew could be a very bad sign indicating the child had exhausted its remaining strength. Inside his cabin, Silas faced immediate practical challenges he had no experience solving. The infant needed food, but his supplies consisted entirely of items suitable only for adult consumption. He had no milk, no soft foods, nothing remotely appropriate for a baby that could not yet eat solid food. He tried various desperate improvisations, mixing water with tiny amounts of honey, attempting to feed the baby small quantities of broth made from jerky, anything that might provide some nutrition and hydration to keep the child alive through the night. The baby accepted some of the sweetened water, drinking weakly but enough to suggest it might survive if he could maintain this minimal nourishment. Silas stayed awake through the entire night, feeding small amounts every hour, keeping the infant warm against his chest, monitoring its breathing, and trying to remember if he had ever known anything useful about caring for children. His own baby had died before he ever held it, and he had avoided thinking about that loss for 3 decades. But now the memories returned with painful clarity as he struggled to save his Mohican child, whose arrival had shattered his carefully maintained emotional numbness. By morning, the baby seemed slightly stronger, its cries more vigorous, its movements less lethargic. Silas felt cautious relief, understanding that crisis was far from over, but that immediate death had been postponed. He spent the second day continuing his improvised feeding schedule, venturing out only briefly to check his snares and gather fresh water. The isolation he had cherished now felt burdensome, because he desperately needed advice or assistance, but had no way to obtain either without abandoning the baby or risking a journey with an infant that might not survive such travel. The following 3 days established a routine of sorts. Silas discovered that the baby would accept very thin gruel made from ground corn mixed with water and honey, which provided better nutrition than his initial desperate measures. He fashioned a crude cradle from a wooden box, lined it with soft deerskins, and placed it near his fireplace where warmth would be constant. He learned to interpret different types of crying, distinguishing hunger from discomfort from a need for cleaning, though his solutions to these problems remained clumsy and improvised. Throughout these days, Silas talked to baby, his voice rusty from decades of disuse but gradually finding its rhythm again. He explained what he was doing as he worked, described the forest outside and the animals he hunted, recounted stories from his past that he had thought forgotten. The infant could not understand his words, but the sound seemed soothing, and Silas found unexpected comfort in having a listener who could not judge or condemn, who simply existed in the moment without bringing complicated histories or expectations. On the 5th morning, as Silas prepared to step outside to gather more water from the spring, he opened his door to find the impossible sight that froze him in place. Warriors, more than he could quickly count, standing in perfect silence around his cabin in a formation that spoke to military discipline and serious purpose. They were armed with rifles, bows, tomahawks, and war clubs, their faces painted in patterns Silas recognized as Mohican, their bearing suggesting they had been there for some time, and were prepared to wait as long as necessary. Silas's first thought was that they had come to reclaim the baby, which made sense and which he would not resist. His second thought was that they might view his possession of the child as theft or violation of some custom he did not understand, which could mean his death was imminent and unavoidable. His third thought was simply acceptance, a recognition that after 3 decades of hiding from the world had finally found him, and whatever came next was beyond his control or ability to influence through pleading or explanation. He stood in his doorway, one hand still gripping the frame, and waited to see what these warriors wanted from him. The baby began crying inside the cabin, and Silas instinctively turned toward the sound before catching himself and returning his attention to the armed men who had not moved or spoken. From a formation, 3 figures emerged and walked toward him with measured steps that conveyed authority and purpose. An elderly warrior whose elaborate dress marked him as a chief or leader, a younger man who appeared to serve as translator or advisor, and a woman whose grief-stricken face and reaching arms told Silas immediately that this was likely the baby's mother's sister or relative. The chief stopped a respectful distance from Silas and studied him with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to whatever lay beneath. Then he spoke in Mohican, his voice carrying across the clearing with a tone that commanded attention. The younger warrior translated into English that was clear despite a heavy accent, and what Silas heard began to explain why 170 warriors had surrounded a forgotten old man's cabin in the remote wilderness. The chief introduced himself as Tekakwitha, leader of a significant Mohican band that ranged throughout these mountain territories. The dead woman Silas had found was named Nutta, the chief's niece, who had been traveling to join family in a distant village when fever struck her suddenly and fatally. Her husband had been killed in a hunting accident several months earlier, leaving her to raise their infant son alone. And when she failed to arrive at her destination, search parties had been sent to find her. They had discovered her body in the abandoned campsite, had tracked the baby's disappearance, and had followed the trail directly to Silas's cabin. The translator explained that the warriors had been watching for 2 days, observing through windows and gaps in the cabin walls, witnessing how Silas cared for the baby with awkward dedication. They had seen him sacrifice his own sleep and comfort, had watched him improvise solutions to problems he clearly did not understand, had observed genuine compassion in his treatment of a child who meant nothing to him and whose survival brought him no benefit. This observation period had been necessary, Tekakwitha stated, to determine whether the old hunter had stolen the baby for nefarious purposes or had genuinely saved a life out of simple human decency. Silas listened to the translation with a mixture of relief and embarrassment, understanding that his every action over the past 5 days had been witnessed by hidden observers, that his clumsy attempt at infant care and his awkward conversations with a baby who could not understand him had all been recorded and judged by warriors he had never suspected were present. The knowledge that his isolation had been violated so completely should have angered him, but he found he could not muster resentment when the circumstances were so clearly extraordinary and the stakes so obviously high. The woman who had accompanied the chief could contain herself no longer. She rushed forward, speaking rapidly in Mohican, her arms reaching desperately toward the cabin where the baby's cries continued. Tekakwitha spoke sharply to her, halting her advance, and through the translator explained to Silas that this was Aida, Nutta's younger sister, and the baby's aunt, who had been consumed with grief and terror since learning of her sister's death and the child's disappearance. The chief asked permission to allow Aida to enter and retrieve her nephew, emphasizing that Silas was being asked rather than simply having the baby taken because his actions had earned him respect that required proper protocol. Silas stepped aside without hesitation, gesturing for Aida to enter. She rushed past him and went directly to the makeshift cradle where the baby lay crying. She lifted the infant with practiced ease, examining him carefully while speaking softly in Mohican, checking for injuries or illness, her tears falling freely as relief overwhelmed her composure. She turned to Silas and spoke words he could not understand, but her tone conveyed gratitude that needed no translation, and he nodded acknowledgement while feeling suddenly bereft now that the cabin was returning to its previous emptiness. Tekakwitha entered the cabin with the translator, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of Silas's sparse living conditions, the minimal supplies, the evidence of decades of solitary existence. He spoke at length while the translator conveyed his words carefully, The chief acknowledged that Silas had saved the baby's life, that without intervention the child would certainly have died within hours of being found, and that this created a debt the Mohican people took seriously. He stated that the careful observation over 2 days had revealed Silas to be a man of honor despite his hermit existence, someone who valued life and acted with compassion, even when doing so brought him no advantage. The translation continued as Tekakwitha explained the significance of what Silas had done. The baby was named Lonato, and he was the last male descendant of a particular family line within the band that carried important hereditary responsibilities and knowledge. Nutta's death had been tragedy enough, but losing Lonato would have meant the permanent extinction of this lineage and the loss of traditions that could not be transferred to others outside the bloodline. By saving Lonato, Silas had preserved something far more important than a single life, and has magnified the debt beyond what might ordinarily be owed for rescuing a child. Silas found his voice, rusty and uncertain after days of speaking only to an infant. He told Tekakwitha that he had simply done what anyone with basic decency would do when confronted with a dying baby, that he had expected nothing and wanted nothing except to know the child would be properly cared for now. He explained his isolation, his decades of separation from both settler and native communities, his complete lack of knowledge about Mohican customs or politics that might have influenced his decision. He emphasized that his actions were instinctive rather than calculated, compassionate rather than strategic, and that he desired no recognition or reward for basic humanity. Tekakwitha listened to this through translation, and when Silas finished, the chief spoke words that changed the trajectory of what remained of the old hunter's life. The translator conveyed that Silas's humility and genuine character only increased the magnitude of what he had done, that acting without expectation of reward demonstrated purity of motivation that commanded profound respect. Therefore, Tekakwitha declared, Silas was being formally adopted into the band as an honorary member, would be provided with supplies and support to ease his remaining years, and would be under protection of the Mohican people for as long as he lived. More immediately, the chief continued, it was clear that Silas's isolation had reduced him to bare subsistence, that his supplies were inadequate and his living conditions harsh even by frontier standards. The warriors had brought provisions, food and tools and materials that would transform his cabin from a survival shelter into something approaching comfort. These gifts were not charity but payment of debt, reciprocity that Mohican culture demanded when life debts were incurred. Refusal would insult both the givers and diminish the significance of what Silas had done for Lonato. Silas struggled to process this sudden reversal of his solitary existence. For 30 years, he had wanted nothing except to be left alone, to live and die without entanglement in the complicated affairs of human society. Now, he was being pulled back into community and connection whether he wished it or not, being honored and adopted when he had spent decades trying to disappear completely. Part of him wanted to refuse, to insist they take their baby and leave him to his chosen isolation. But he recognized that such refusal would be both ungracious and impossible, that forces had been set in motion that could not be reversed by his preference for solitude. Over the next several hours, the warriors unloaded supplies with the same efficient organization that had characterized their arrival. They brought preserved foods in quantities that would sustain Silas for months, blankets and furs of quality far superior to his threadbare possessions, tools to replace his worn and broken implements, and even a small amount of tobacco and other trade goods. They repaired structural damage to his cabin that he had been ignoring due to lack of energy or materials, reinforced his roof against the coming winter, and improved his fireplace to make it more efficient and safer. Aida remained inside with Lonato throughout this activity, nursing the baby and gradually calming both the child and herself. Through gestures and her limited English, she communicated to Silas that she wanted to understand exactly how he had kept Lonato alive, what foods he had improvised, what techniques he had used. Silas showed her his crude feeding implements and explained his trial and error approach, feeling embarrassed by how primitive his methods seemed compared to what a knowledgeable caregiver would have done. But Aida listened with serious attention, seeming to recognize that his ignorance combined with determination had been sufficient to preserve her nephew until proper care could arrive. Before departing, Tekakwitha made Silas a formal offer through translation. The band's main village was approximately 3 days' journey to the northeast, and Silas would be welcome to visit whenever he wished, to see how Lonato was growing, to receive any assistance he might need as he aged, to participate in community gatherings if isolation ever became burdensome rather than comfortable. The chief emphasized that this invitation was genuine and ongoing, that adoption into the band created permanent bonds rather than temporary obligations, and that Silas's hermit preferences would be respected, but need not be absolute if he ever chose connection over solitude. Silas accepted the invitation with cautious gratitude, not certain he would ever take advantage of it, but recognizing that refusing would be insulting after everything that had been offered. He watched as Aida prepared to leave with Lonato, wrapping the baby securely in traditional carriers that Silas's crude cradle could never match. The infant had settled into peaceful sleep after nursing, his face relaxed and content in ways Silas had not managed to achieve during 5 days of desperate improvisation. Aida approached Silas one final time before departing, taking his weathered hand in hers and speaking words of Mohican that the translator conveyed as a blessing, a prayer for long life and peace in his remaining years, a promise that Lonato would be told the story of the forgotten hunter who would save him when no one else was there to help. The warriors departed as silently as they had arrived, their formation dissolving as men melted back into the forest with practiced efficiency. Within an hour, no visible evidence remained of their presence except the supplies now stacked in and around Silas's cabin, transforming his sparse existence into something approaching abundance. He stood alone in the clearing, feeling the weight of silence return, but finding it somehow different than before, less absolute and more temporary, as if his isolation had become optional rather than inescapable. The weeks that followed brought adjustment to circumstances Silas had never anticipated experiencing. The supplies the Mohicans had provided meant he no longer lived on the edge of starvation, no longer rationed every mouthful or worried constantly about whether his traps would produce enough to survive another week. He found himself with leisure time, hours in each day not consumed by desperate scrambling for basic necessities, and this unexpected freedom forced him to confront how much of his identity had been built around mere survival, rather than any deeper purpose or meaning. He began maintaining his cabin and surroundings with more care, making improvements he had always postponed as unnecessary luxuries. He cleared brush from around his spring to create easier access, repaired his snares to make them more effective, even attempted to plant a small garden, using seeds the warriors had included among their gifts. These activities gave structure to his days, but also highlighted how much time he had simply been existing rather than living, how decades of isolation had reduced him to animal-level functioning, where each day was identical to the last, and nothing accumulated or progressed toward any goal. 3 months after the warrior's visit, Silas found himself thinking increasingly about Lonato, wondering how the baby was thriving, whether he had gained weight and strength, whether Aida was managing the challenges of raising her sister's child. These thoughts surprised him because he had spent 3 decades deliberately not caring about other people's lives, had cultivated emotional distance as a survival mechanism against the pain that connection inevitably brought. Yet somehow 5 days of caring for a helpless infant had cracked that protective shell, had reminded him that human beings were not designed for complete isolation, regardless of the wounds that drove them to seek it. One crisp autumn morning, Silas made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He gathered supplies for travel, secured his cabin as well as he could for an extended absence, and began the 3-day journey to the Mohican village whose location Tekakwitha had carefully described. His motivations were complex and not entirely clear even to himself. Partially, he wanted to see Lonato, to confirm the baby he had saved was thriving. Partially, he was curious about the people who had shown him such unexpected generosity and respect. But perhaps most honestly, he was lonely in ways he had not allowed himself to acknowledge for 3 decades, and the prospect of human connection no longer seemed as threatening as the prospect of dying alone without having spoken to another soul. The journey taxed his aging body more than he had anticipated, reminding him that 72 years had taken their toll despite his continued functionality. He navigated using landmarks Tekakwitha had described, occasionally encountering Mohican hunters who recognized him from descriptions and offered guidance or brief companionship on the trail. These encounters were initially awkward, his social skills atrophied from disuse, but the hunter seemed to understand his discomfort and made no demand for conversation beyond what was necessary. When Silas reached the village, he was greeted with a formality that both honored and embarrassed him. Tekakwitha himself came out to welcome him, and word spread quickly that the old hunter who had saved Lonato had arrived for his first visit. Aida appeared with a baby, who had indeed grown and thrived in the months since Silas had last seen him. The transformation from the desperately weak infant he had found to this healthy, alert child was remarkable, and Silas felt unexpected emotion well up as he realized his improvised care had made the survival possible. Over the following days, Silas experienced community in ways he had forgotten were possible. He was invited to share meals, to participate in daily activities, to observe ceremonies and traditions that revealed the complexity and sophistication of Mohican culture. People approached him with genuine interest rather than judgment, asking about his decades of solitude not with mockery, but with curiosity about how someone could survive so long alone. He found himself telling stories he had not thought about in years, revisiting his past with less pain than he had expected, discovering that time and distance had softened wounds that once felt permanently raw. Tekakwitha spent significant time with Silas, explaining the pressures his people faced as colonial expansion continued relentlessly into their territories. The chief spoke of villages displaced, of populations decimated by diseases that ravaged native communities, while leaving Europeans relatively unscathed, of the desperate struggle to maintain cultural identity and autonomy in the face of overwhelming forces that viewed indigenous peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than humans with rights. Silas listened and learned, beginning to understand the broader context within which his small act of saving one baby had taken on such significance. The chief explained that individual acts of compassion between their peoples were rare enough to be noteworthy, that most interactions involved violence or exploitation that poisoned relationships and made trust nearly impossible. Silas's rescue of Lanado without expectation of reward or even acknowledgement represented a kind of purity that gave hope that not all settlers were enemies, that human decency could transcend cultural boundaries when individuals chose character over prejudice. Tekakwitha stated that Silas's example will be told in their oral histories, will be passed to future generations as proof that bridges between peoples were possible even in the darkest times. Silas returned to his cabin after a week in the village, but the isolation he had cherished for 3 decades now felt different, less like refuge and more like voluntary imprisonment. He found himself making regular visits to the Mohican community, timing them to coincide with significant events or simply arriving when loneliness became more burdensome than his preference for solitude. He watched Lanado grow from infant to toddler to young child, developing a relationship with a boy that was part grandfather and part honored elder, teaching to track animals and read forest signs while learning from Aida about Mohican traditions and values. The years passed with surprising speed, and Silas discovered that his final decade was richer and more meaningful than the previous 3 decades of isolation had been. He became a bridge of sorts between the Mohican community and occasional settlers or trappers who passed through the region, using his trusted position with both groups to facilitate peaceful interactions and prevent misunderstandings that might escalate into violence. His age and obvious lack of self-interest gave him credibility, and his willingness to listen to all perspectives made him valuable as an informal mediator when conflicts arose. When Silas was 81 and clearly approaching the end of his life, Tekakwitha arranged for him to be brought to the village, so he would not die alone in his cabin. Silas protested weakly that isolation had been his choice, and he had no fear of solitary death. But the chief insisted that someone who had saved one of their children and who would become truly part of their community would be honored in his final days rather than abandoned to loneliness. Silas was too weak to resist, and privately too grateful for the company to maintain his protestations.